All we can experience are different accounts of the past. We can experience different constructions of the past. We cannot experience the past itself. It's gone. It's lost to us forever. That means the historical Jesus, as Jesus actually existed in history, is inaccessible to you. You will not find him. You cannot find him. You will never find him. What you can do is, using the trades, the tricks of the trade of modern historiography, you can play by the rules of modern historiography, and you can construct a historical Jesus.
No, but the thing is the methods they're using aren't actually logically valid. So there actually is no support for the methodology by anyone who's actually done a dedicated study of the methodology being used in it.
That's a construction, though. So those theoretical points are very important, because when I talk about the historical Jesus, you cannot think, like most popular people think, that what I'm talking about is the real Jesus, the Jesus as he really was, or certainly not the Jesus of Christian faith. What I'm giving you is an account of Jesus that modern historians construct using the typical tools of modern historiography.
Where people are basically looking at the Gospels and figuring out, I like this and I don't like that. And the stuff that they liked, they determined was historical, and the stuff they didn't like, they determined was not historical. And then following that, particularly in the 1960s, under the influence of a fellow named Ernst Käsemann, the idea that, well, we have to get back to the historical Jesus. We can't just do these little snippets, and it's not just a whole existential whatever, but there's got to be some real history here, because if there's no real history, then there's nothing to hold on to in terms of things like the incarnation. So Käsemann developed a series of methods or approaches by which he thought he could get back to the historical Jesus. And these are sometimes called the criteria of authenticity.
So here are some things that I think we can agree about, most historians might agree about. First, the sign on the cross. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Anybody else? One verse says, "This is Jesus of Nazareth." And it's because the 4 different Gospels have slightly different wording. But they all have something version of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which is, of course, why you sometimes see this abbreviated from the Latin. Jesus of Nazareth, in Latin, Rex, King Iudeorum, of the Jews. So that, notice how, though, it's slightly different. Let's look, if you've got your Bibles, it's Mark 15:26. It's also Matthew 27:37. Also Luke 23:38. And it's also John 19:19. So that's what we've got. One of the things that most scholars will say is, we think that's historical. And why do we think it's historical? Well, for one thing, it comes from at least 2 independent sources, right?
There are 2 major ones, both of which are problematic. One of them, often referred to as the criterion of multiple attestations, suggests that if Jesus said something or did something in 2 or more independent sources, then it's got a higher claim to historicity. Well, the problem here is we don't know if we've got independent sources or not. So for a while, it was Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're all interdependent, and then John's over here in left field. And so if it's something in Matthew, Mark, and Luke matches up with something in John, then it must have happened. Biblical scholars are increasingly thinking that John had access to all 3 of the synoptic gospels, all 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So no independent material there. So if we can't find independent sources, we can't get back to Jesus. Moreover, even independent sources are not necessarily historically credible.
What are the 2 independent sources that it comes from? It's in all 4 Gospels, but all 4 Gospels aren't independent sources, are they? Why? Because we believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark. So if Matthew and Luke copied it from Mark, that makes Mark one source. Did the author of John use the Gospel of Mark? Not according to the theory we're using in this class. Some people might say yes, some scholars might say yes, but in this class we're going on the theory that the Gospel of John probably didn't use Mark as one of his sources. So you've got the Gospel of John as one source for this, you've got the Gospel of Mark as another source for this, so you have 2 of what scholars are willing to treat as independent sources, which both have this nice little piece of data, this datum right there.
We have essentially 10 different versions of the historical Jesus promoted in the field. every single historian cherry picks the evidence that he wants to try and argue for his particular version of it.
Now, the other thing is that it might be interesting to for you to know, King of the Jews is not a Christological title that early Christians used about Jesus. Remember in the Gospels, we've seen a lot of different titles for Jesus. He's the teacher. He's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He's the Holy One of Israel, we just saw. He has a lot of things, and these things are obviously things. Early Christians called him Lord. They called him Son of God.
The expression, the Son of Man, was a fixed expression, fixed and well-known title, referring to a well-known eschatological figure, a kind of, who's usually understood to be a heavenly being who would come. It is thought that it's, in some sense, his nature is based on the figure of Daniel 7, who seems to be a heavenly being who appears on the clouds of heaven and comes to earth.
But they didn't call him King of the Jews. It was one of the titles of Jesus that apparently the earliest followers of Jesus didn't latch onto. It goes against the tendency of the Christian writers themselves because it's not one of their titles. If it had said, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the Lord of heaven and earth, then scholars would say, well, that sounds like a Christian confession. But saying Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, doesn't sound like a Christian confession. So it goes against the tendency of the writers themselves, and we say, well, maybe then it's historical. Maybe it's a little glimpse of history sitting in there. In other words, the question was, didn't this come from the mocking terms in the trial?
Romans normally just executed rebels without due process, yet for some reason Jesus received a high-profile trial involving important leaders and celebrities, including the Jewish high priest, Pontius Pilate, and even King Herod himself. Jesus also had thousands of his own supporters, including such high-ranking leaders as a royal official, a centurion, a temple leader, and members of the Jewish ruling council. Yet nobody recorded any of this. And it's not like these events occurred in some backwater region. Judea was a highly important strategic province for Rome, and during Jesus' time, the region was one of the most well-documented in ancient history. Many contemporary writers recorded great volumes of information about the area. They even described several failed Jewish messiahs. Yet despite...
That's exactly right. The Christians, if you notice, it's the people who are mocking Jesus who call him King of the Jews. And so why... this is not something that the Christian writers want to invent and then put in the story.
And the second criteria, which was more disturbing to me, is sometimes called the criteria of dissimilarity or the criterion of embarrassment. And the basic model was if Jesus says something or did something in the Gospels which would be antithetical to first century Jewish practice or belief and not quite in line with what the church wanted to proclaim. In other words, if it just looks really weird, then Jesus must have done it or said it. And that doesn't quite work either. And in terms of what the church would consider to be embarrassing, well, if they put it in the Gospels, they could have thought it was that embarrassing.